personal perspective, I think this would be good if Social Security was not taxed.
When we're dealing with taxing Social Security, not everyone pays taxes.
The backbone of most folks' retirements is Social Security.
If your person can't answer that question you just asked, you need a different advisor who specializes in retirement planning. Welcome to the show. So, if you've paid attention to the news, there is some information floating around that possibly Trump could eliminate Social Security taxes.
This was a big campaign promise, and it's something that I think is a really interesting issue. And will we see it happen? Will we not? We gotta talk about it.
Sure, but we need to talk about it in case it does. And we talk a lot about Social Security, so I thought that would be a good topic.
I think it is, and over the years, this is a big planning issue for our clients.
Sure.
The backbone of most folks' retirements is Social Security, and many of our clients who have saved in other ways, IRAs, 401ks, even brokerage accounts, they're affected by the taxation of Social Security. Many retirees don't know it's happening, but by the time folks get to retirement, in some cases, it becomes a little bit late to plan, or it becomes harder to plan. And so there's a ton that we want to talk about today. We'll talk about whether we think this is realistic to get implemented or not, and how you can plan around it. So let's get into it.
Okay, let's go. Okay, so when we're dealing with taxing Social Security, not everyone pays taxes.
That's true.
It is based on how much you make in Social Security and I think outside of Social Security. So this isn't going to affect everyone, but I think for the ones that it does, it just seems kind of ridiculous because you pay Social Security, that is kind of a tax on your income. So you've already kind of paid a tax on it, and currently they tax it again for a lot of us. So how is this going to play out, you think?
This is a really, really interesting, really challenging issue. Obviously, there's a big voter bloc that is interested in having this happen. And frankly, from a personal perspective, I think this would be good if Social Security was not taxed.
Sure.
Now, on the other hand, I can understand why they do tax it.
Our government's broke, for one thing.
Yes.
So
there's all of these different debates about it. What I think is really important to me is this is a backbone of the kind of planning that we do with folks. Is, when we're talking to folks, and even when we're talking to people who are potential clients, one of our talking points, we've said this in previous videos, but one of my arguments is, if you want to find out whether you have the right advisor to get to and through retirement, ask them how their Social Security is going to be taxed. Or another way to say it, it's very specifically the way that I say this is, if you want to know if you've got the right advisor or not, go to them, and don't do this via email, but do this in person. If you have an in-person meeting, don't tell them you're going to ask them this question, and ask them, hey, how is provisional income going to affect my retirement? And just see what they say. If they turn red and they begin to sweat and they begin to stumble over their words and they can't give you a coherent answer,
the deer in the headlights look.
Yeah, don't get mad at me, or you can email me if you want, but they might be a nice guy, but they're not the right person to help you get through retirement. And the reason is provisional income. What you've asked them is, how do I avoid having tax on my Social Security? That's really what you've asked them. To anyone who is an expert in the field and who has done this more than twice, they know exactly what you're talking about.
Sure.
But that's huge, because that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars over your lifetime.
Well, we see this every day. Someone's like, oh, I've got an advisor. I've had the advisor for 20 years. I'm good. Well, that's like saying you have a doctor and they've been your doctor and now you need surgery, mitral valve surgery. It's like, no. I've got a doctor. No.
That's exactly it.
Yeah, you go to a specialist because your situation changes. You need a different set of expertise, and people think financial advisors are financial advisors. No, just like everything, attorneys, doctors, everybody, they specialize. If your person can't answer that question you just asked, you need a different advisor who specializes in retirement planning.
As you're talking, I completely agree with you. as you're talking, what it makes me realize is that, you know, advisors who don't really do a whole lot have done a great job of marketing that they're the same as everybody else, and and minimizing the power and the importance of specialization.
Sure.
And so that's a really interesting issue. But Social Security and focusing on Social Security. Look, if they eliminated the tax on Social Security, retirees would have more money and would spend more money. But the CBO estimates that it's going to cost about $1.5 trillion over the next 10 years. And so part of me goes, you know what? What's another $1.5 trillion between friends, right? Yeah. I mean, at this point,
we spend $6 trillion a year. Yeah. So what's another $1 trillion to give seniors a little more money to spend?
And the idea is that it would incentivize them spending money and putting that back into the economy. Now, on the other hand, some people are like, well, it would accelerate the time in which the Social Security Trust would go bankrupt by a whopping 1 year.
Oh, really?
Isn't that hilarious? Instead of going broke in 2034, we'll go broke in 2033. Oh. And honestly, I go, you know what? Let's do it. That's how I feel personally. If we're gonna have a hard conversation and do some hard, it is like a surgery thing to me. It's like you've got a bad splinter that really it's like, we're gonna have to deal with this. Mm-hmm. We might as well get it over with. Yeah.
Stop ignoring it. Let's just deal with it.
So that's how I feel personally. Do I think this legislation will pass? Probably not, to be candid with you. Sure. The senator that's promoting this has done this since 2014, every single time. And they're trying to get this done. Do I wish that it was law? Probably, because it affects my clients, and I care about my clients, and that they would have a better experience. But I don't think they're going to be able to get the budget straightened out on it. Now, if they did, what would end up happening is they're going to tax us more. Do I like that? No. Is that probably what's going to happen over the next 5 to 10 years? Yeah. So part of me goes, let's get it over with. I don't love talking about this, but it's relevant and it's important for folks to understand. Yeah. So another stat that I think was interesting is that the way that this bill would work is they would use funds from the general fund to cover the gap, which makes sense. In 2023, that was approximately $50 billion, and that represents about 4% of the trust's income is the tax on Social Security. Okay. So it's super interesting in the environment that we're in right now, where we're talking about this, like what's $1 billion between friends, and I'm going, okay, for $50 billion a year, we could eliminate a very confusing and frankly, in a lot of ways, unfair tax on retirees. Let's do it. We could find another place we can cut $50 billion. Well, yeah. I mean, that's kind of how I feel about this, Todd.
Yeah. I just read this morning, I get a newspaper actually, and Elon Musk has cut $100 billion, and he's just getting started. Now, you may agree with that or not agree with that, but I think everyone would agree there is some waste out there.
Absolutely.
A lot of waste, and he's already cut $100 billion. So $40 billion, that's a lot of money, but in the scheme of things, like you just said, it's really not that
the way our friends in Washington spend money, that's like an hour and a half. And, there's a lot of complexity in the way that this, gets handled in Washington. Mm-hmm. But I'm a big fan of the idea of simplifying some of this legislation and the way some of this stuff works. Mm-hmm. Now, when I say that, I want you to hear that part of our job is to simplify this for our clients. Right. And so does that make it harder for us to do our job, or that we would become unnecessary? I don't know, but I really don't care about that. Yeah. I mean, we have people that they will pay us to solve these problems for them, regardless of how simple they are, because it's not worth their time to worry about it. Yeah. And that's fine. And so I don't think there's any reason that we shouldn't simplify things. It benefits everyone.
And we've made this really easy for the people. Okay. There's a link at the bottom of the page that you can click, and we will ask you for some very basic information. Give us that information, and we'll do a video for you that addresses your specific information, your specific issue, and give you some ideas on things you can do. So,
and it's free. We don't charge anything for it. Now, we're not giving any specific advice at that point, but we want you to have an idea of where you stand in retirement. And so, that's a great resource that we're providing for folks. I think, there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of like budgets and legislation and how this stuff works and all these big numbers. But what's really important is, the retirees or the folks that are pre-retirees that are thinking about when to retire or in the early stages of their retirement, the uncertainty of how this is going to work, how this is going to affect their income, how this is going to affect their retirement. I think this is what's important. And so that's what I really want to talk about. If you're preparing for retirement, my thought is this is probably not something until it's really settled. You don't want to assume that there's not going to be tax on Social Security.
True.
And so this is my encouragement, right? But this is also the reason that you want to work with professionals who are going to take your specific information, put it into a system that makes sense to tell you what's going to happen and how that applies to your situation. Yeah. And so sometimes I get frustrated when all of this stuff is happening because it creates uncertainty and fear for people, and they don't have a great way of filtering through that and taking action. And that's the hardest part. And so, that's why we're doing this education. That's why we're making these videos so that we can help folks go from, being confused, being uncertain, being afraid, to beginning to take action and figure out where they are in the process of preparing for retirement or how safe and secure their retirement is, to getting some clarity about those things.
Yeah. It's just crucial. Get specific, personalized information, not cookie cutters. So many times people come in, it's like, my agent said, we tell everybody to blank.
It's amazing.
Ian's head almost explodes when they say that.
But it's true.
If your guy says we tell everybody, you're in the wrong office.
Mm-hmm. What I'll say that we do for everyone is we customize exactly your plan for your specific needs. That's what we do for everybody. So I think what I want to tell folks that are watching this, that are reading these articles, that are concerned about this type of stuff, get a plan for yourself, okay? We had someone that came into the office just last week who was getting ready to retire, was concerned about when to claim Social Security. This has been a cornerstone of our planning process since day one because it's so, so important. And so what we did is we walked through the stages of the planning process. And the first step is figuring out what is your income going to be in retirement and where is that income going to come from. And so the key piece there is we create a report for what your Social Security is going to be like. We figure out when the ideal time to claim your Social Security is. And that varies based on your, whether you're single, whether you're married, what your health situation is like, what other assets you have. There's no cookie cutter answer. And it takes analysis to be able to determine what the right claiming strategy is going to be. But the reason that we focus on income first before we focus on risk and taxes is if you don't have sufficient income to retire, you can't retire. And if you're going to run out of money in retirement, we're not worried about taxes because you don't have a tax problem if you run out of money. You got a running out of money problem. Okay. And so I mean, it's just, we have to chuckle about it a little bit, but it's true.
Yeah. People without money don't have tax problems.
And if you don't have any money, we don't have a market risk problem. Yeah, volatility is not an issue if you run out of money. And so we start with income, and a cornerstone of that income is Social Security. And how is that going to play in with your other income sources? And so this client came in and, she was getting ready to retire, didn't have a plan to create Social Security, had some outside investments. And so we did a comprehensive analysis of her picture. And what we found was her Social Security claiming strategy is going to be different than what she thought. She thought she was going to claim early, defer her investments. When we worked through everything, that wasn't the optimal scenario. Yeah. It was different based on her spending and based on her assets. And so we can't tell you exactly what we told her to do because her situation is different. But what we can tell you is you need to create a plan for yourself so that you can address these things. So let's figure out when you need to claim Social Security, whether or not your Social Security will be taxable, regardless of whether they change the rules, so that you can have a better picture of this working into retirement.
We have a link for you. There's a link at the bottom. Click that, and it will ask you some specific information, not much, just enough for us to give you a general instruction and say, here's what you're looking at, not advice.
Give an idea of, what are some of the potential challenges that you may be facing, or are there things that you need to be addressing that you maybe didn't know were a problem or were a concern. So click the link below, fill out the information. We'll send you a video back and begin to have that conversation.
All right. Thank you all very much, and we will see you next time. Bye.